Hello and welcome. It's Wednesday, the 12th of March. You're tuned in to our 10 a.m. newscast coming to you from ARIRANG's news centre in Seoul. Let's take a look at what's making the headlines. Korea and Canada conclude their negotiations for a bilateral free trade agreement. Officials say the FTA could be signed as early as June after legal reviews by both sides. South Korea's top military officer tells his American counterpart that Seoul is open to closer security ties with Japan to counter threats posed by North Korea. Plus, the search for the missing Malaysia Airlines jetliner is now focused on the Malacca Strait after military radar suggests the plane turned west away from its planned route before disappearing. We start this morning with some great news on the nation's trade front. Following their second summit talks in just 6 months, President Park Geun-hye and visiting Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper wrapped up talks on Tuesday on a free trade deal between the two countries. Our presidential correspondent Choi Yoo-sun starts us off.
Korea's comprehensive trade pact goes beyond goods and services to include investments, finance, and intellectual property.
이번 FTA 협상 타결은 양국 간의 통상과 투자를 포함해서 호혜적인 협력을 더욱 확대하기 위한 제도적 기반을 마련할 것이라는 점에서 매우 의의가 크다고 생각합니다.
It will create jobs and opportunities for Canadians today and just as importantly for the generations that follow.
Over the next 10 years, each side will lift tariffs on nearly 98% of goods. For Korean automakers whose products make up almost half of the nation's $10 billion annual exports to Canada, the 6% tariff barrier will be removed in 2 years. This means Korean companies like Hyundai and Kia, which currently make up 12% of the Canadian market, will be able to make further inroads in the North American country. While more than 200 farm products, including rice, are exempt from the deal, relatively high tariffs of up to 40% on Korean beef and pork will be partially lifted over the next 5 to 15 years. To allay concerns among Korean livestock farmers worried about the impact of trade deals with both Canada and Australia, Seoul says it's working on measures to assist them. Canada is now Korea's 12th FTA partner. After the deal is signed and approved by the parliaments of each country, it is expected to go into effect next year. Stressing that bilateral security cooperation is as important as economic issues, Prime Minister Harper expressed support for President Park's trust-building policies towards North Korea. The two leaders then urged Pyongyang to completely and verifiably rid itself of all its nuclear arms. Choi Yoo-sun, ARIRANG News.
And while we're speaking of FTAs, Korea is also making headway on another free trade pact, this one with Vietnam. A fourth round of free trade talks between Korea and Vietnam kicks off on this Wednesday in Ho Chi Minh City. The two sides are expected to hold discussions on various areas, including products, services and investment. The talks are scheduled to run through this Friday. Negotiations for the bilateral FTA were launched all the way back in September 2012. Vietnam is Korea's second largest trading partner among ASEAN nations. The vice foreign ministers of Korea and Japan will hold very rare talks in Seoul on Wednesday on a range of security and bilateral issues. But as our Hwang Sang-hee tells us, no one is hoping up much hope for any significant warming of the two countries' frosty ties.
Amid souring ties between South Korea and Japan, Japanese Vice Foreign Minister Akitaka Saiki will arrive in Seoul Wednesday for talks with his South Korean counterpart, Cho Tae-yong. Wednesday's talks will be the first vice ministerial-level meeting between the two neighboring countries in 8 months. But Seoul's foreign ministry says it's not a sign of thawing ties.
The South Korean government repeated several times what steps Japan must take for progress in Korea-Japan ties.
Japan has yet to officially apologize for its wartime sexual enslavement of roughly 200,000 women in the early 20th century. In an interview with Japan's Mainichi Shimbun Tuesday, Chinese ambassador to Japan, Chang Yong-hwa, called out Tokyo for its lack of responsibility over historical issues. Speaking about why the annual trilateral summit between South Korea, China, and Japan did not take place last year, the Chinese diplomat blamed Japan and said he does not see such a meeting happening in the near future. But U.S. President Barack Obama will try to mediate when he visits Seoul and Tokyo for summit talks in April. Washington wants its two allies to put history behind them, concerned the intensifying friction will affect their trilateral alliance. Ahead of President Obama's trip, the three leaders will meet at the end of this month in The Hague for the Nuclear Security Summit. Some point to the possibility of a trilateral summit, but the chances of the two neighbors shaking hands are slim. South Korean President Park Geun-hye has made it perfectly clear that she will not sit down with a leader who fails to acknowledge his country's historical wrongdoings. Hwang Sang-hee, ARIRANG News.
And as we just heard there, Seoul and Tokyo's relationship has soured over recent months and years due to a range of historical and territorial issues. But South Korea's top military officer has stressed the importance of coordinating with Japan on security issues in the face of continued threats by North Korea. Speaking to reporters in Washington on Tuesday, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Choi Yoon-hee, said South Korea, the US and Japan must form a tight trilateral partnership to deal with the constant and unpredictable threats posed by the North Korean regime. He added that the South Korean military remains on a firm combat readiness despite Pyongyang's recent peace offensive. Che is on a week-long trip to the US on the invitation of his American counterpart, General Martin Dempsey, for talks on security issues facing the Korean Peninsula. North Korea has developed a number of sophisticated ways to get round UN sanctions on illegal weapons trading. A UN report issued on Tuesday as part of an annual accounting of North Korea's compliance with UN sanctions. It says North Korea's embassies in Cuba and Singapore have helped facilitate illegal arms deals. The report adds that there's a relatively complex corporate ecosystem of foreign-based firms that help the regime evade scrutiny of its financial dealings. The panel cited an example of a contract by North Korea's national carrier Koryo to purchase 2 new jetliners in 2012. It said more than 100 payments were structured through 8 different Hong Kong-registered companies. Now, while the purchase of civilian aircraft is not prohibited under UN sanctions, the report says such unusual activity could in fact be used as a test run for illegal transactions. A North Korean flagged tanker laden with crude oil from a rebel-controlled port in Libya has escaped its naval escort and is headed for international waters. A member of Libya's General National Congress said Tuesday that the tanker took advantage of poor weather conditions to head for the open sea and that the ships that were surrounding it were not in a position to follow it. The Libyan government said Monday that they had stopped the tanker as it tried to leave the Al-Sidra terminal, but a spokesman for the rebels had insisted at that time that the rebel was still under their control. Now, Libya's parliament, furious with the ship's apparent escape, dismissed Prime Minister Ali Zidane on Tuesday. Defence Minister Abdallah Al-Thani has been named interim Prime Minister. The 37,000-ton tanker named Morning Glory is believed to have taken on over $30 million worth of crude sold without the government's permission.
Get connected to Korea and the world. Join us every weekday for the latest developments out of Korea, Asia, and beyond. On air, on your mobile, and online, we lead the way every day. ARIRANG News.
To try and resolve the crisis in Ukraine, the European Union also offers $15 billion. A landmark deal on Iran's nuclear program has opened the door for more business transactions with Korea. Seoul's finance ministry says it will begin allowing business dealings next week with Iranian companies with more in more than 10 service sector categories, including business consulting and automotive design. The ministry says the move is expected to boost transactions of goods, particularly in the fields of construction, communications and automobiles. Service sector transactions between the two countries have been restricted in recent years due to international sanctions over Tehran's suspected nuclear development. The volume of exports between Korea and Iran in the service sector came in at more than $1 billion in 2009, but shrank to $340 million in 2012. Now, 3 years have passed since the meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan, and the effects of that disaster are still being felt to this day. To mark the third anniversary on Tuesday, a group of lawmakers right here in Korea held an event in Parliament to call on the government to reduce the country's dependence on nuclear power. Our National Assembly correspondent Ji Myung-gil has this report.
Lawmakers at the National Assembly urged the government to reduce the country's reliance on nuclear power as its main source of electricity at an event Tuesday held in remembrance of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. The lawmakers advised the public not to forget the lessons of the incident in Japan and to consider the implications for Korea. One lawmaker reported on her 3-day visit to radiation-exposed sites around Fukushima.
After 3 years, most of the contaminated areas stand in neglect, and people are still suffering. The Japanese government says the Fukushima disaster is mostly under control. There is a big problem with remarks like that and the Korean government's plans to build more nuclear power plants.
Han Myung-suk, who leads the Parliamentary Sustainable Development Committee, lashed out at the Japanese government for restarting the country's nuclear reactors.
The Japanese people, and especially children, are still suffering 3 years after the crisis. The Abe administration has broken its promise of denuclearization, and I believe the government is out of its mind to restart the nuclear power plants. Abe is sure to be disregarded by his people.
Meanwhile, the government is trying to use more renewable energy resources. The National Assembly has its own solar panels, which generate roughly 165 kilowatts of electricity per year. The panels are capable of reducing carbon dioxide levels by some 87 tons per year. Last year, the National Assembly passed a bill requiring that 10% of the electricity in all new buildings in Seoul that are more than 100 square meters come from renewable energy resources. The bill also requires that more than 50% of the lights in the buildings have LED bulbs. Ji Myung-gil, ARIRANG News.
Korea's scandal-ridden spy agency is under fire yet again. Prosecutors raided the headquarters of the National Intelligence Service through the early hours of Tuesday over suspicions it fabricated evidence in an espionage case. Yulian reports.
The nation's spy agency is staring down the barrel of another scandal. Prosecutors on Tuesday are digging into documents seized during a 7-hour raid of the National Intelligence Service overnight. The NIS, already a target of public criticism for meddling in the 2012 presidential election, is suspected of tampering with documents to support its charge that a Seoul city government official is a North Korean spy. The suspicions have gained traction in recent days. After an NIS informant claimed he had yet to receive money he was promised for faking the documents. The prosecution's raid came hours after President Park Geun-hye ordered a thorough investigation into the case. This is the second time the prosecution has raided the spy agency since President Park came into office more than a year ago. In April last year, prosecutors looked into allegations that the National Intelligence Service's former chief ordering agents to drum up support online for then-candidate Park in the 2012 election. Late last year, the National Assembly passed a bill requiring an overhaul of the spy agency and banning it from participating in domestic politics. The back-to-back scandals are fueling the public's distrust of the NIS, with opposition politicians calling for the resignation of NIS chief Nam Jae-jun. Depending on the investigation outcome, NIS agents involved in the scandal could be charged with breaching the national security law for the first time ever in history. Yurian, ARIRANG News.
Good day, I'm Eunice Kim, and here are your headlines from around the world. It's been 4 days, and the hunt continues for missing Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. Malaysia's military now believes the plane had not only turned around, but had in fact flew hundreds of kilometers off course after its last contact with air traffic control. Paul Yi reports.
The Malaysian military has reportedly tracked the missing jetliner by radar over the Malacca Strait. The location is quite far from where the passenger plane last made radio contact with air traffic controllers off the country's east coast. The Boeing 777 apparently vanished 1 hour after taking off from Kuala Lumpur for Beijing on Saturday. Since then, there has been no confirmed trace of the aircraft or the 239 people on board. A military official close to the investigation told Reuters that the plane had suddenly changed course, taking a lower altitude, and then made its way to the Malacca Strait. The disappearance is being considered one of the most unprecedented cases in recent aviation history. Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 had made no distress signal or indicated that there was any problem, leaving investigators to search through the passenger list and crew manifest for clues. Interpol Secretary General Ronald Noble said Tuesday that the two passengers who used stolen Austrian and Italian passports to board the missing plane had been identified. Noble said the two young men entered Malaysia using valid Iranian passports. He said 18-year-old Paria Noor Mohammadi and 29-year-old Delavar Said Mohammed Raza were likely trying to migrate to Germany. Interpol said it was unlikely that they were part of a terrorist group. Meanwhile, Malaysian police earlier said they had not ruled out the possibility of hijacking, sabotage, or mechanical failure. Paul Yi, ARIRANG News.
And as you heard, Interpol investigators have discounted terror links to the two young men on that flight with stolen passports. However, CIA Director John Brennan said terrorism could not be ruled out as a factor at this point. The investigation continues. And over in Ukraine, interim leaders moved to establish a new defense force on Tuesday and appealed to Western nations for aid. Acting President Oleksandr Turchinov said the National Guard would be sourced from veterans, as the country is said to only have 6,000 combat-ready men. Its air force is said to be outnumbered 10-1 by Russia's fleet. Meanwhile, the EU agreed a package of trade breaks to Ukraine worth $700 million. This as the French Foreign Ministry said it could impose a series of sanctions against Russia as early as this week that would include asset freezes and travel bans. And from Russia, ousted President Viktor Yanukovych declared that he remains Ukraine's legitimate president and commander of its armed forces. Acting President Turchinov countered by saying that Yanukovych left the military in such a poor state that it had to be built effectively from scratch. Over to Washington now, where the head of the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee has accused the CIA of spying on Congress. Chairwoman Dianne Feinstein expressed her grave concerns, accusing the CIA of searching committee computers to probe how its staff accessed an internal agency review, thereby possibly violating the principle of separation of powers outlined in the U.S. Constitution. CIA Director John Brennan has denied the charges, and the clash comes as the Senate Intelligence Committee is examining the spy agency's interrogation and detention program that began after 9/11 during the Bush administration. Mad cow disease has reared its head for the first time in a decade in Greece. The country's local daily Katimerini reports 2 cows with BSE were found dead in a farm in central Greece. Authorities have since quarantined that farm, and the pair of dead cows were said to be imported from the Netherlands. And Paris topped the list of the most popular tourism destinations in the world. This according to the Île-de-France Regional Tourism Committee, which cited hotel occupancies. The tourism body found that the City of Lights attracted more than 32 million people last year, recording the highest level of foreign visitors as well in 10 years. The most number of people came across the channel from Britain, followed by Americans, Germans, Italians, and Chinese. Visitors from the Middle East also recorded an over 20% increase, while the number of French tourists to Paris dropped by 7.5%.
Now, it's been weeks since the Sochi Winter Games came to a close and weeks since Kim Yeon-ah retired from figure skating. But despite all that, the Korean Olympic Committee continues to fight with the IOC and the International Skating Union over the controversial second-place finish. And with that, the situation has been brought up to the head of the ISU, asking them if everything that needed to be reviewed was reviewed, challenging the judges' scoring during the free skating performance. The Korean Olympic Committee also added that they plan to have experts review the performances by Kim Yeon-ah and Adelina Sotnikova and even make legal investigations if required. And over to curling this time, as the South Korean curling team got some good news on Tuesday, as Ujeongbushi is looking to build the nation's first official curling rink. The Gyeonggi-do province and Ujeongbushi will be looking to build the nation's first official curling rink in hopes that the Olympic team prepare for the Pyeongchang Winter Games in 2018 and the growth of the sport here in the nation as well. While there are 2 ice rinks here in the nation currently being used as curling rinks, none of them are regulation-sized curling rinks. And of course, with the recent success of the South Korean women's curling team, the sport continues to get support. And shifting over to the AFC Champions League group stages, where the Pohang Steelers were able to pull away with a 2-1 win over Buriram United of Thailand, thanks to 2 first-half goals from Kim Tae-soo and Kim Seung-dae. Meanwhile, FC Seoul drew 1-1 against Beijing Guan thanks to an equalizer from Koryo Han in the 72nd minute of the match. And with that, over to some Tuesday night's V-League action. The Korean Expressway beat Hunguk Insurance Life Pink Spiders 3-2 as the Korean Air Jumbos took on LIG. So let's take a look at the highlights. Now, the Korean Air Jumbos, looking for their second straight win, look great against the LIG greatest, combining both the offense and the defense in this game. LIG unable to win a single set here, as Michael Sanchez of Korean Air Jumbos put up 30 points on the night, as the Korean Air Jumbos take this match 3-0. And finishing things off in tennis, where 2 defending champions at Indian Wells made an early exit, as Maria Sharapova and Rafael Nadal both lost in the 3rd round. First off, Maria Sharapova going up against Camila Giorgi lost in 3 sets, 6-3, 4-6, 7-5, giving the Italian her first win against a top 5 player. Then it was Rafael Nadal who failed to advance to the next round as well, as he lost in 3 sets against Alexander Dokovalov of Ukraine, 6-3, 3-6, 7-6, 5, despite rallying back in the 2nd set. And that's going to wrap it up for me. This has been SJ. Have a great rest of the day, and see you guys again for your sports needs.
This morning started out relatively mild compared to what we've had last few days. And the good news is, though, that we'll finally get some of the rain we need. The rain clouds have been hanging over the peninsula since early this morning, and more clouds are pushing into the country to drop showers. And as we can see on our radar, the rain clouds are moving into the southern parts of the nation. So we'll start to rain from Jeju and the southern coast at about noon, then gradually spread to other regions. Now, Seoul and the surrounding areas can expect about 5 millimeters of rainfall, while the southern coast and Jeju could receive up to 80 millimeters of showers today, and possibly snow in some parts of Gangwon-do at night. And these all should take some dryness out of the weather, or the air, that is. So it will be a wet and breezy day today, and here are the readings. The afternoon highs in Seoul, Daegu, and Gwangju will rise to 10, 15, and 13 respectively, while Busan get up to 14 later in the day. Now, for other regions, it looks like down on Jeju and Daejeon will climb up to 16 and 12, while the top temperature on Mount Keungang will be at 3 this afternoon. Now, that's all for now, and back to you, Mark, in the studio.
Well, thank you very much, Jiyeon, for the weather there. And that's all for now. Thanks ever so much, as always, for joining us. We'll be back at noon Korea time. But in the meantime, you can always catch up with what's been happening news-wise on our website, which can be found at arirang.co.kr/news.